Hey, um, there may be some others that are going to be joining us. We'll see. Usually that happens as we kind of move along here. Um, as most of you know, I think you probably know that this past Sunday was what? Groundhog Day. Oh, good, good. So, okay, where is he? I did this just for him, and he's not even here. I'll tell you. Pardon me. He's on his own channel. He's on the Patrick channel. So yeah. So, anyways, well, yeah, we'll have to send this to him. Thank you. Okay.
We could always bring it back next week too, right?
Oh, that reminds me. By the way, um, Patrick and I talked after class last week for quite a while, and he mentioned that um, when Gary Calloway finishes his class in a couple weeks, that he's going to be teaching a class, probably about 6 weeks or something like that, in short segments, some apologetic type things. I don't know if that's general knowledge yet, but it'll probably be in the bulletin in the next few weeks. So what I want to do tonight before we start is actually I want us to go back to the future. Okay. I want you to go back with me to January 31st, 1973. And the reason I chose this is because January 31st was just a few days ago. It was last Friday, as a matter of fact. January 31st is a big deal for me. It's a very big deal for me, okay? Because 52 years ago on January 31st, okay? Yeah, that's me, okay? 52 years ago, a former Marine, and my life was absolutely in the toilet. It's a nice way to put it at that point. Um, it was 52 years ago that I trusted Jesus Christ as my Savior. And I never forget that date. It's ingrained in my mind, and it will be there forever because on that night, worked late with another fellow who had actually trusted Christ just about a month before that, and his name was Andy. We were friends. We worked together at a architectural office, and Andy didn't know a whole lot, but he knew two verses from the Bible. He had one of those pocket Bibles that we all carried back in the 70s, right? Um, and these are the only verses that he actually had marked in his Bible. And he shared those verses with me. He shared those verses with me. Those are two of the most important verses in my life. And they're two of the most important verses that I use when I witness to people. Andy didn't tell me that I needed to stop sinning. Andy didn't tell me that I needed to turn my life around. He didn't say any of those things. He told me that, just like Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says, that by grace we're saved through faith, that not of ourselves, it's the gift of God. And that idea of gift is pointing back to the idea of being saved. Okay, our salvation is a gift. It's not by works. It's not by works, so that none of us can boast. No one in this room can boast before God that they saved themselves, because you know as well as I do, we can't. We can't. Salvation is a gift. It will always be a gift, and it is received as a gift by faith, by believing, by trusting, by placing your confidence in the finished work of Jesus Christ. That's what saves a person. Everything else, if there's a but after that, you need to get it out of the way, because nothing else matters except for understanding that salvation is a gift, and it's given to anyone that will accept it freely. There's no strings attached to the gospel. No strings attached. The verse that everyone knows, John 3:16, that God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever does what? Believes in him will never perish, but has everlasting life. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. I cringe when when it gets muddied up, or when there's things that are added to it. I hear it all the time, and it just it's what's the term? The hackles on your neck. That kind of like raises mine whenever I hear that, because the gospel is simple. It's simple enough that children in these rooms tonight are probably understanding that. And that's the beauty of the gospel. It has to remain simple. It has to remain a gift, and it has to remain something that none of us work to obtain. If that's ever in your gospel presentation, you really need to kind of step back and rethink the way you present the gospel. Okay? That confuses people. I'll tell you what, if Andy would have told me, as long as I was smoking back then, big deal, who wasn't? And doing other things. But, if he started giving me a list of things that I needed to change in order to come to Christ, I probably would have told him what he could do with that little Bible of his, because I was raised in a church where that's what you had to do. There was a grocery list a mile long, and you had to keep everything that was on that grocery list, or you weren't going to get into heaven. And then maybe there was a question if you even would get into heaven by keeping that list. So we need to be careful. Like I said, I'm not saying anything that doesn't go along with I believe what we represent here in this church. Okay, we need to keep our gospel presentation simple, and we need to not confuse those, especially to have no spiritual insight whatsoever as to what they need to do. These two verses work beautifully, beautifully. Acts 16:31. That when the Philippian jailer asked, "What do I have to do to be saved?" What does Paul say? Well, the first thing you need to do is no, he didn't say any of that stuff, did he? He said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved. That's imperative. In other words, that will happen right then. That will happen right then. So, just something I wanted to share with you, since it's my, I guess, spiritual birthday. Yeah, thank you. And a lot of people don't know, their spiritual birthday, but I don't think we're going to get graded on that when we get to heaven. So, anyways, we have to move along because time is fleeting, and I have to make sure that we have time left for our class tonight, right?
So it's fine.
So let's get going. I'm a child of the '60s. What can I say? Okay. Um, we are on part 3, or I can't part 3, C2C in our study. We're talking about modern day anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism. Okay, that's where we're at tonight. We've looked at all these other things over the last month and a half or so, and gone into great detail. All the studies, of course, as Greg said, it's up on the YouTube channel. All you got to do, if you want a refresher or if you missed a class or two, go up there and check it out. Okay, along with part 1, which is where we started in our study on who owns the land. So that goes back to the November timeframe. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, it's kind of like deja vu. It's kind of like deja vu. I know some of you will get this, some of you won't, but it's we've been here before. We've been here before, haven't we? And it just goes on and goes on and goes on. And I wished I could say it's going to get better, but it's not going to get any better until the Lord comes back and redeems his people at the end of the tribulation. That's down the road. Who knows how long? But we are in a point now where we're looking at the history of anti-Semitism. So let's talk a little bit about some of the historical facts that take place in what I'm calling the modern phase of anti-Semitism, the modern phase of anti-Semitism. Olivia Melnick, who I quote just about every week anymore because he's a great source for me anyways, says this in his book on end-time anti-Semitism. The modern era didn't bring much hope of a better life for the Jewish community. If Jews couldn't be converted or changed, they had to be contained and controlled. That was the thinking of the modern of modern anti-Semitism. And what I want to do is kind of walk us through some of the things that I'm sure most of you aren't even aware of that has gone on in history, and then we'll kind of bring it up to the World War II era as we wrap up tonight. Okay, there is a and this is all new to me. There is a section of land that's called the Pale, P-A-L-E, of Jewish settlement. This is what it looks like. It's a geographical area. It's up on the board there, where Jewish people could live within the Russian Empire, similar to a large ghetto. Keep that word ghetto in mind. Okay, approximately 1 million square miles. This area was set aside. It's called a Pale, and I had to look this up. It's a region or a district that's enclosed by an imposed boundary, which was this area. It's a separated jurisdiction. This area here is the area where the Jews fled to from Europe. They were contained there, more or less. And I really didn't know a whole lot about this until I started reading about it. This wasn't a haven for them. They were contained there, but they were also persecuted there. This wasn't a safe zone by any means. It just happened to be a place that the Russian Empire. Now you have to remember, we're back in the late 17, early 1800s, where Russia was a power to be dealt with then, and they set aside this whole area as a place where the Jews would be allowed to go, but they were still going to be controlling them in this area known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement. Now, I mentioned this word. Oh, it's not on here. It's on mine. Okay, yeah, it is. This word here, ghetto. Ghetto. We all know that word, don't we? And we all think we know where it came from and what the idea is behind it. So, take a sidestep with me. Okay. Anybody recognize this area of the world? Venice, Italy. It was the first place to create a Jewish ghetto in the 1500s. The first place to create a Jewish ghetto, and the word ghetto is actually an Italian word. It's actually an Italian word, and it means casting. It means casting. Also, another definition for this word is foundry. And I believe that comes from where they put the Jews in Venice. They put the Jews on an island in Venice. Because if any of you have been to Venice, you understand that Venice is connected by, bridges, and there's canals and all that, and it's cut up into different sections. The Jews were contained in a small island at nighttime, but they were allowed out during the. It's called the Jewish Quarter. Actually, it still exists today. You can go to. It's not a so-called ghetto, but it's the Jewish Quarter. They were allowed out. The Jews were allowed out during the day only if they wore a yellow patch that identified them as Jews. Then they could leave the ghetto the Jewish quarter and go out and make a living or whatever. Okay. I just thought that was interesting because, we know about the ghettos pre-World War II, especially in Poland. Well, there's a lot that's been written about that, and there's a lot of history behind that. But this word ghetto actually comes from the Italians. That's my folks. I don't take any pride in that one, of course. But anyways, this pale that we're talking about, these are the countries, the modern day countries that it includes. Okay, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Moldova, Ukraine, Western Russia. That's all part of what's known as the Pale of Jewish Settlement. Okay. Now, Russia had all this territory, and eventually it gets divided up. And we're not here for Russian history or whatever. But look at the bottom of the screen on the right there. By 1910, there were 5.6 million Jews that lived in the Pale area. By 1910. Okay. So we talk about and just jump down the road, not too long, the 6 million Jews that will be killed during World War II. Well, there's, 5.5 million of them already just in this area here. That's not the rest of Europe. That's not the rest of Europe. So the Jews are going to be confined to this area, and they're going to be confined. You can see the dates up at the top there. Okay. From the late 18th century through the time of the Russian Revolution. Yes.
Where they were living and they fled to there, or was there some kind of legislation that you said that they were required to stay there?
My understanding, it's a mixture of both. Yeah, there was persecution, and we've talked about that going on throughout Europe. But since most of the Jews were going into this area, I think a lot of other Jews wanted to go to be with other Jews, so they wound up there in this pale. Okay, how many of you have seen this movie or the play? Okay, we're not going to break out in song or anything. Okay, so the story of Fiddler on the Roof takes place during this time period. And if you can think back to the movie, okay, it's been actually, I'm trying to think. Jane and I just watched this just within the last year. We watched this, the original movie. The story does take place in the Russian Pale of Jewish Settlement, and there's another anti-Semitic program that's going to be executed on the Jews while they're in this area, and it's called a pogrom. A pogrom. Okay. Now that's the way I pronounce it. If it's wrong, come see me afterwards and correct me. I've tried to look up the pronunciation. I've heard it pronounced many different ways. It sounds a lot like program, but it's not. It's a different word altogether. These the pogroms take place during this time that Fiddler on the Roof is going on. Beside them being contained in this area, these pogroms are going on also. Well, what's a pogrom? Program is an organized, and this is from the American Heritage Dictionary down at the bottom of the screen there. It's an organized, often officially encouraged massacre or persecution of minority group, especially one conducted against whom? The Jews. So when you hear, and I don't know if you're familiar with this term or not, it's new to me. And you may not think any more about it after this class, but it's something that was established by the governments of that area just so they could come against the Jews. Now remember, they're contained in the Pale, big area. And as the pogroms get moving along, they just like towards the end of Fiddler on the Roof. You remember the story? Remember how they had to basically leave everything they had, throw it on their carts, or carry it with them and move on to another. That's how the pogroms worked. The only thing that's left out of Fiddler on the Roof is the massacres that took place. Within the movie, there's persecution, but there's also massacres that took place. So the Eastern European pogroms, starting in the 1800s, government-sponsored riots against the Jewish people. The first one's recorded in Odessa in 1821. 1821. They started after the establishment of the Pale. So we have the Pale coming into existence in the early 1800s. And shortly after that, the pogroms start against the Jews. They started after the establishment of the Pale, and often as a result of the Jews' refusal. Remember we talked about forced conversions last week? Well, that's what was going on. Instead of them being forced to convert to Catholicism, they were being forced to convert to Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Okay, that's kind of where they were at. So, the word pogrom is actually a Russian word. It's actually a Russian word, and it actually means devastation. Interesting, isn't it, that they would name a program devastation, which is what it did. It devastated the Jewish people. It devastated them. Eventually, the Pale of Settlement's going to come to an end. I mentioned this already, but in 1917, that's when the Russian Empire will collapse and fall to the Communist Revolution. When that takes place, the Pale basically is dispersed. The Jews, there were still Jews living in those areas, but many of them, many of them left, went elsewhere. At this point, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? So these people are still being persecuted even after the fall of the Russian Empire. Even after the fall of the Russian Empire. Questions, comments?
So they came into the Pale voluntarily, and it was almost like they were going in as a sanctuary because it was better than anything outside the Pale.
Pretty much, and I don't know if it was one of those things that they may have been forced. Again, I just, I didn't dig deep into this. Maybe some of you might want to look into it a little bit more this week, but I think a lot of them were forced into it. But I'm sure there were a lot more that just migrated there simply because there were other Jews there. Okay, that's my take on it. My take on it. So anything else? So just when you think it couldn't get any worse, guess what? It's going to get worse. Okay. One of the biggest anti-Semitic hoaxes is born in the early 1900s. I've heard many speakers talk on this, and it's rather interesting. This whole thing that we're going to look at here. There was a book that was published in the early 1900s called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Has anyone in here ever heard of that or read portions of it? You can download it. As a matter of fact, you can go on Amazon if you want to and buy it, although I wouldn't do that. But it's something that was published by the Russian government, and the fellow that wrote it, Sergius Nihilus, I think is how you say his name, he's an anti-Semite. He wrote it. And what the protocols of the Elders of Zion is supposed to be, it's supposed to be minutes from a secret Zionist meeting. And those minutes basically are talking about what the Jews are going to do to take over the world. All the things that need to happen and how they, the Jewish people, will eventually conquer the whole world. Okay, you know, it's a hoax, but guess what? People ate it up. People ate it up. Why? Because the hatred of the Jews, of course. We're blaming everything else on the Jews. Let's blame the idea that they're ready, they want to take over the world. And so this comes out, it's published, and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of copies of this are making its way, not just around Europe, but also around the world. Also around the world. Melnick says this in his book again. He says, the protocols are the best known example of forgery, as well as one of the earliest examples of conspiracy theory. They are filled with cliches and platitudes on how the Jews would take over the world, while never containing any details or specifics. Now, think about that. Okay. This gets, the idea of conspiracy theories is shouldn't be something new. I mean, we hear about it all the time. Okay. I've heard someone say that it's not a conspiracy if it's true, which makes sense, but this was not true. This was not true. This was a spin. As a matter of fact, it was such a spin that even today, people are referring to the protocols as an example of what the Jews are planning for the world, how they're going to take over the world. Okay. Most of us know this man, I think. Henry Ford. He was I'll just call him a devout anti-Semite. Okay. He was so convinced of the authenticity, of the protocols, that he published 500,000 of them and gave them out during the 1920s. Okay. This is the man that invented the assembly line. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. And first of all, if you read a little bit, I don't want to talk about Henry Ford too much, but he actually owned the Dearborn newspaper. That's where the plants were, the Ford plants were located. He owned the newspaper there in Dearborn, and for a number of years. And so it was basically his bully pulpit. Okay, he could write whatever he wanted to. Well, after he published these, they went everywhere. They went everywhere. Now, remember, they were published in Europe in the 1905 time frame, maybe a little bit later. And by 1920, they're already here in the States, and someone like Ford is spreading them out everywhere he goes. Okay. We're going to talk about it, Adolf Hitler here in a moment, but Hitler quotes from the protocols in his book Mein Kampf. Okay, he quotes from the protocols. Okay, that's where the anti-Semitism comes out in Mein Kampf. Okay, the neo-Nazis today, along with other anti-Semitic groups, continue to refer to these protocols, even though they've been recognized as a hoax since the early 1920s. There is not a word in them that's true. They've been proven to be a hoax, and yet they're continuing to be published and republished and republished again. And like I said, the I hate to say ultra right, because I don't know what you call it. I call them neo Nazis. Are the ones that are using a lot of this information for their purposes. So again, just something else that came out, that now the Jews are being blamed because they want to conquer the world. Well, how are they going to conquer the world? Well, you have to read the protocols to find out how they're going to do that. Okay, interesting. Let's move on. We're in the time frame of World War One. Okay, in World War One, we actually talked about World War One in our study on the land back in November, and what we learned is that World War One is going to set things in motion for the Jews to eventually have their own nation. But that's basically going to go on the back burner because Nazi Germany now is going to take center stage in what we're calling this modern history of anti-Semitism. So there's a lot that we learned about during that took place during World War One. I don't know if you recall at all the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Accords that were made. Those were all positive things, saying that the Jews should have their own homeland. Okay, that was right after World War One took place. And those things were in motion. And as time progressed, they slowed down. They got bogged down to the point where it doesn't take long before we have Nazi Germany. Now you got to remember, Germany was totally destroyed in World War One, and it was going to take someone with a unique gift to rebuild that country and make it not just a place of a place where it was totally reborn, but make it a place of power throughout that decade from about 1933. Well, that's the Holocaust years. Let me put that up there. 1933 to 1945. Okay. During that time frame, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism are going to come to a head. They're going to culminate in what we call the Holocaust. The Holocaust. Now, everyone in here knows the Holocaust. We all know a little bit about this that took place, a little bit about that took place. So my intention over the next few minutes is not so much to relive the history of that time frame, but just to kind of point out some of the keep saying highlights, and they're really not highlights, but some of the events that took place during that time. And then what we'll do next week, because I didn't. I'm shortening the class tonight because I was going to get to a point where we were going to have to go full bore into what took place in Germany, and I didn't want to crunch it into the last 15, 20 minutes of class. So what I'm going to do is do that. We'll pick that up next week. Okay, but I still have a little bit more to go. Right. Okay. So we know the time frame we're in. We're in the 1930s through the 1940s. Okay. After World War One, of course, Germany is in shambles. Hitler is a veteran of World War One. I don't know how many of you knew that. He fought in World War One. But he becomes head of the Nazi Party in 1921. And he's going to be in prison just a few years later because of a coup that he was involved in. They locked him away. Too bad he was let out later. But anyways, while he's in prison, he writes this book, Mein Kampf, which is German for my struggle. My struggle. And he writes that in 1923. This is an outline of basically what he's about to do when he becomes Chancellor of Germany. I mean, it's like, talk about, telegraphing your game plan. That's exactly what he did in Mein Kampf. He telegraphed the entire world, anyone that wanted to read it, what he was going to do once he took over Germany. And it wouldn't be too long after this that he would. He's an extremely charismatic individual, and we could probably go back and forth on this. A lot of people believe that he was demon possessed. That he was demon possessed. We could argue that. I mean, even some of the way he speaks is when he gives his speeches is totally different than when he speaks normally. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. We're dealing with someone that is not so much a madman. A lot of people want to say he was insane. This is not an insane man. He knew exactly what he was doing. Exactly. And he was. He was. And his book tells everyone what he's going to do. But who was listening? Well, the German people weren't, because they needed someone to come in and lead them as a nation. And so in 1933, he becomes Chancellor of Germany. And that's when the Third Reich is born. 1933, Hitler is promoted to Chancellor. He's over the entire country, everything. And he rebuilds Germany like it's never been rebuilt before. Okay. Second bullet there, having completed control of the government, he begins his plans for what becomes known as the final solution. We know it as the Holocaust, but the final solution was the plan to exterminate every Jew, not in Germany, not in the conquered countries, but all of Europe. That was his plan, to exterminate all of the Jews. The Germans went outside of Germany and brought Jews back into the concentration camps. That's never been done before. Okay, a government went outside their jurisdictions, grabbed Jews and brought them back into Germany and other places where they were. Well, we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so that's just a little bit of what's going to transpire during this period known as the Holocaust. Okay, and again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. We're all familiar with it. I also don't want to minimize it neither. Okay, we know the figure of 6 million Jews that were killed, but there were an additional 6 million other individuals that were killed. All you can just go right down the line. Of what's going on in our country today. Those groups that are protesting the way they're protesting, they were carted off to the concentration camps. Okay, I read about Jehovah's Witnesses were rounded up and brought to the concentration camps, and it goes on and on and on. Yes, there were 6 million Jews that were killed, but there were millions more other Germans that were killed just because they were undesirables. They were undesirables. So we need to keep that in mind to kind of balance this out. Yeah, I know we're talking about anti-Semitism, but when it comes to this subject of the Holocaust, we need to understand that this is the worst thing that's ever taken place for the Jews up to this point in time. But there were another 6 million individuals that were killed also during this time period, 1933 to 1945. And it's kind of interesting how they go through different ways that they're going to exterminate individuals. And they finally come up with what's known as the final solution a little bit later in the early 1940s. So questions, comments? I know this isn't a very easy thing to sit through. It's a tough teaching. It really is. But these are the facts as best as I can find from history, and we just need to keep that in mind. We're moving. As a matter of fact, this is I think my final slide for tonight. Yeah, I'm going to let you out early. I know. Some of you are saying yes. Anyways, next week we're going to wrap up our study of modern anti-Semitism, and so you can see I have a big chunk to cover next week. So we'll talk about the Holocaust. We'll talk about what took place after World War II. And then, we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about Israel becoming a nation. We covered that in part one. So we'll move on through the next several decades quickly until we get to where we're at today and talk about, anti-Semitism that's happening around the world. And we'll spend most of our time talking about what's happening in our country, and what has happened over the last few years. So that's where we're going. Just so you know, and hopefully we can wrap that up next week, and then the following week we'll put together, the what do they call it? The so what questions. Okay. Okay, we spent a lot of time looking at all this. So what? Now what do we do? Now what do we do? Okay. So questions, comments. Again, I know we're stopping a little bit early. This is it's almost like a miracle in itself. But we're going to go ahead and stop here. Any questions, comments?
What's the
Yeah.
name of the play that West Movie did?
That was good. That
Was it Fiddler? I couldn't remember the name of it for sure.
Hmm.
I thought that's probably where you guys saw it.
No, actually, we watched the movie. We rented the movie because it was we hadn't seen it, and gosh, I can't remember the last time we saw it. So good to watch every now and then. So yes,
History, we certainly have heard all of the things that led up, but all of the people that have such hatred, a lot of reasons for it. We've heard those, but there also seems to be something a little demonic behind it all.
oh
That many people to be caught up
yeah,
There's a
and
lot of
being
people.
taken in.
Yeah, but they don't even know why they're.
That's it.
Yes.
So it makes you think that there's other things.
Yeah.
there's I haven't put the definition up in weeks now, but that's part of the definition. It's a
Yeah, it's on your first album.
it's a belief, that it's not only just a hatred for the Jews, but it's a demonic hatred for the Jews. And yeah, that's very true. It's very true.
It seems like there was, I don't know if it's on English, I don't know where it was, it was in black and white. It's been on. I caught it about 2 months ago. It was World War II, but it was all of the newsreels and everything, and then it went into all of this about the Jews and
Mhm.
Hitler and his plans, and it gave and it was long.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I watched it off and on. I know I'd go in and catch 30 minutes of it here and 30 minutes of it there, and it
Yeah.
just was hours and hours of it. And
Mm-hmm.
they explained it all. He had a plan, and they had.
Oh, he did. He did. I mean, he was so obsessed, and this is why I'm convinced, that he was demonically controlled, because he basically lost World War II because all of his efforts went into this,
Right.
went into exterminating the Jews. The things that I read, and we'll probably bring some of it up next week. That the railroad system in Germany was perfect for what he wanted to do. And instead of using it to send troops to the front, especially the Russian front, because that's where, once they lost Russia, it was almost, it wouldn't be long. But, because of what he did, basically taking all of the railroads in Europe that he was controlling at that time, he was using them to bring the Jews to the concentration and to the death camps. Okay, I mean he was so obsessed with that he wouldn't be dissuaded, and you certainly didn't cross that man and live to talk about it, anyways. So, yes, sir.
Was his cheese?
Oh boy, I really don't know. I really don't know.
But he wasn't a pure blood, though.
No, Aryan, he wasn't.
No, I mean,
Oh, Hitler. Yeah. No, he wasn't.
He kept that real fun.
Yeah. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, let me head and we'll close this in a word of prayer. And yeah, boy, Now, do I get these extra minutes back? That's, always the question that comes up, isn't it? So,
We just take the liberty of making that you're the teacher.
maybe I can.